The Newlyweds bought an old mansion to start a new life, but soon, behind the walls of the house, they found something that had been hidden for over a century. A secret room, an old diary, and the terrifying secrets of the past changed their lives forever. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The spring air carried with it the scent of renewal when the young couple pulled their car onto the gravel drive. It had rained the night before, and the ground was still soft, leaving shallow tracks behind them as they approached the house that had been waiting in silence for so many decades. To anyone else, it might have looked like the ruin of better times, a husk left behind by families long gone and dreams that had crumbled with the plaster and wood. But to them, it was possibility itself. Their hands were still newly bound by rings that caught the sunlight filtering through the clouds, and their minds still warmed by the vows they had spoken only weeks before. This, they believed, would be the place where their lives truly began. The house stood like an old sentinel on the edge of town, 3 stories of weathered brick and sagging gables that bore the scars of years without care. Built in another century when craftsmanship was as much about pride as it was about shelter, the mansion still retained the faint dignity of its design. Tall windows, once graced with colored glass, now showed spiderweb cracks and streaks of dust. A once grand porch leaned dangerously toward the lawn, and ivy crept like veins across the walls. Yet, beneath the decay lay a grandeur that whispered to anyone willing to listen. I was magnificent once, and I could be again. They had heard of the property through a whisper of chance. It was offered cheaply, almost suspiciously so, the kind of place most people would dismiss with a shudder. There had been attempts to restore it before, but each ended the same: frustration, abandonment, and, finally, silence. The locals spoke of it as if it were cursed, not in the sense of hauntings and ghosts, but cursed with an endless appetite for money and energy. Yet, when the couple walked through its sagging doorway for the first time, they didn't see rot and ruin. They saw hoist ceilings that might once more echo with laughter, staircases that could bear children rushing down them in the mornings, gardens that could blossom again with care. To them, the house was no curse. It was a test of their resolve and a canvas for their love. Inside, the air smelled of dust and time. Sunlight struggled through broken panes and fell in weak golden shafts across warped floors. The walls bore layers of peel-in wallpaper, each pattern hinting at another family, another era, another hand that had once smoothed paste against the plaster. Their footsteps echoed through the hollow rooms, and with each echo they imagined what once had been. Here, perhaps, a parlor where music played and skirts brushed across rugs. There, a dining room where candles once burned low into the night while laughter mixed with the clinking of silverware. The house was empty now, but it was not lifeless. It carried the weight of memory, and it welcomed them like a keeper relieved to see new hands willing to tend its wounds. They walked together from room to room, their excitement growing despite the clear challenges. The ceilings sagged ominously in some places, and the scent of mold rose strongest near the baseboards. The wooden banister, though carved with intricate swirls and leaves, was loose in its posts and splintered to the touch. But neither the smell nor the decay could break their determination. The young woman traced her fingers along the frame of a doorway, marveling at the craftsmanship while her husband gazed upward at the stained glass panels that still clung stubbornly to the upper landing of the staircase. These details, fragile as they were, promised a beauty worth uncovering. When the realtor had unlocked the door for them the first time, she had warned them with a half-smile that they would need not only deep pockets, but also stronger patience than most. The couple had exchanged a quick glance then, the kind that contained an unspoken agreement. They didn't have deep pockets, but they had each other, and they believed that was enough. They were not afraid of hard work, nor of time. They had youth, love, and determination, and they wanted to anchor those gifts into something lasting. Where others saw only burden, they saw a foundation. Where others saw ruin, they saw a beginning. The purchase went through quickly, perhaps too quickly, as though the house itself were eager to pass into new hands. The papers were signed with a kind of nervous joy, their signatures binding them not only to each other, but also to the fate of this decaying giant. Friends and family were skeptical. Some tried to dissuade them with stories of how much repairs would cost, of how dangerous old wiring and rotten beams could be. Others simply shook their heads and muttered that young people always thought they could change the world with dreams. But the couple did not listen. Their decision was made, and their hearts beat faster at the thought of what lay ahead. On the first evening after the purchase, they returned to the house alone, without the realtor or anyone else. The sun dipped low as they carried a blanket and a lantern inside. They had no furniture yet, no comforts beyond what they brought in the car, but they spread the blanket on the dusty floor of what had once been a drawing room and sat together in the fading light. The house groaned around them as the night settled in, the wood adjusting with sighs and cracks, and outside the trees whispered against the broken shutters. Yet inside, they felt safe. They felt chosen. With lantern light flickering across their faces, they whispered their hopes for the life they would build here. Children's laughter, long dinners with friends, quiet mornings in the garden. Every corner of the house seemed to lean in, listening, as though approving of the promises spoken within its walls. As they finally lay back, staring at the high ceiling that was still adorned with faint patterns of plasterwork, the young man reached out and laced his fingers through his wife's. She turned her head toward him, her eyes glowing with the same mix of exhaustion and excitement that he felt. They both knew the road ahead would not be easy, but it would be theirs, and that was enough. The mansion, with all its secrets and sorrows, had found new keepers. It would no longer stand in silence. It would no longer crumble forgotten. It had been given back to life. What they did not yet know was that the house had more to offer than just walls and a roof. Beneath the cracked paint, behind the warped boards, in the shadows of the attic and the darkness of the cellar, it kept stories waiting to be told. It held fragments of the lives of those who had come before, some buried in dust, some deliberately hidden, and all eager for discovery. The couple had stepped into more than a home, they had stepped into history. And with each nail they drove, each board they lifted, and each corner they scrubbed, the house would begin to reveal itself, piece by piece, to those bold enough to listen. As the lantern flickered lower and the quiet of the house deepened around them, they closed their eyes, dreaming not of what the house was, but of what it could become. Outside, the wind rose against the gables, carrying the scent of wet earth and spring blossoms. Inside, love and determination breathed warmth into cold walls. And thus began their story, a story that would tie their lives to the mansion's hidden past in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The first night in the mansion had been filled with a strange mix of excitement and unease, but when the morning came and sunlight streamed through the fractured panes of glass, the couple felt ready to begin. They rose from their blanket on the floor stiff and sore, brushing dust from their clothes, and gazed at the vast emptiness of their new home. Now the dream was real, and reality demanded work. the house would not transform itself. They had taken ownership of its cracked walls and sagging ceilings, and the task ahead stretched long and heavy like the shadows in its corridors. Yet, with youth and determination burning brightly, they embraced the challenge. The first days were dedicated to clearing away years of neglect. Dust rose in thick clouds as they carried out broken furniture left behind by unknown occupants. Rotten rugs were rolled up and hauled outside, releasing clouds of moths that fluttered weakly toward the light. Wallpaper, faded and curled, peeled from the walls with reluctant sighs, revealing layer upon layer of colors and patterns that spoke of different decades, different families who had once made their mark on the house. Each strip seemed to whisper a story, and though the couple laughed at the absurd floral prints and somber stripes, they felt a deepening connection with those who had come before. But the house resisted them at every turn. Pipes burst without warning when they attempted to test the water, sending rusty streams cascading across the floors. The roof, weakened by decades of storms, leaked whenever the clouds gathered, and buckets were scattered through the rooms like silent sentries catching the steady drip of rain. At night, when exhaustion drove them to rest, the house groaned and creaked, the beams shifting with a language of their own. Sometimes the sounds were so sharp and sudden that they startled awake, convinced for a moment that footsteps moved in the halls. They reassured one another that it was only wood, only age, but still they slept lightly. Despite these difficulties, moments of discovery fueled their determination. While cleaning the upstairs hallway, the young woman noticed a small door set low into the wall, almost hidden behind a loose panel. With effort, they pried it open, revealing a narrow cavity where dust lay thick. Inside were a bundle of old keys tied together with twine and the crumbling remains of a letter, its ink faded beyond recognition. Though the words were illegible, the simple fact of its existence stirred their imaginations. Who had hidden it, and why? What secrets had been tucked away in the quiet spaces of this house? They kept the keys, their metal still cold and strong, despite the years, wondering if one day they might find the locks they belonged to. In the garden, where weeds rose high like a wild sea, they uncovered fragments of a wrought iron fence twisted and half buried in the earth. Digging through the soil, they found that it had once encircled the property in elegant patterns of spirals and fleur-de-lis. The young man traced the rusted designs with his hand, imagining how proudly the fence must have stood when the mansion was young. It was as if the land itself was offering them reminders of its former glory, urging them to restore what had been lost. The days became a rhythm of labor. They swept, hammered, scrubbed, and tore down what was too broken to save. At times, they quarreled, tempers fraying under the strain of endless work and dwindling money. Yet each argument ended with reconciliation, for both knew that giving up would mean more than abandoning a house. It would mean betraying the dream they had promised each other. Their marriage, like the mansion, was in its first fragile stage, and both required patience, endurance, and faith. One evening, as they worked in what had once been the parlor, they discovered a detail that took their breath away. Beneath layers of dust and paint, the young woman noticed a shimmer of color near the window. Gently scraping away the grime, she uncovered a fragment of stained glass, its reds and blues still vibrant despite the years. As the setting sun passed through, the colors spilled across the floor in patterns of fire and ocean. They stood in silence, holding hands, overwhelmed by the beauty that had survived beneath neglect. In that moment, they knew they were not merely repairing a house, they were rescuing a treasure. Yet the house continued to test them. A colony of bats burst from the attic when they attempted to clear it, sending them stumbling back down the stairs amid shrieks and laughter. Mold crept across the basement walls, its damp stench filling their lungs as they scraped and scrubbed. The banister of the staircase collapsed suddenly beneath the young man's weight, sending him tumbling onto the landing with a bruised arm and a shaken laugh. Still, they pressed on, their bond deepening with each trial. The house seemed determined to prove that only those willing to suffer for it would be worthy of its secrets. At night, when exhaustion forced them to stop, they often sat on the front steps with their tools beside them, gazing at the darkened outline of the mansion against the starlit sky. They spoke of the future they were building inside those walls, a home filled with warmth, where children might one day run through the halls, where friends would gather, where love would echo louder than the creaks of wood and the sighs of time. Their voices carried into the night, mingling with the wind in the trees, and the house seemed to listen, waiting to reveal more. Slowly, they began to feel that they were not alone in their efforts. There were moments when the house seemed to guide them, when the beams of sunlight fell at just the right angle to reveal a crack, or when their hands brushed against hidden details that had been waiting for discovery. It was as though the house wanted to be restored, but only by those who cared enough to look beyond its decay. They felt chosen, not cursed, and that feeling gave them strength when exhaustion threatened to overcome them. And so the first steps of restoration turned into weeks of toil, their lives consumed by the labor of bringing the house back to life. The mansion resisted, but it also rewarded. With every broken pipe came the discovery of a hidden cabinet. With every leak came a chance to see colors dance across the floor through stained glass. It was a rhythm of struggle and wonder, of sweat and revelation. The house had begun to speak to them, not in words, but in secrets revealed slowly, as if testing their patience. As the season deepened, the couple realized that their journey had only just begun. They had cleared enough to see the bones of the house, but beneath those bones lay more mysteries. And somewhere above, in the dust-laden rafters of the attic, something waited, something that would carry them even deeper into the lives of those who had once walked these halls. The house had given them a glimpse of its past, and it would not stop there. It was only the beginning of its revelations. The work of restoration had begun to carve its rhythm into the days and nights of the young couple. Their hands were calloused, their backs sore, and yet their spirits refused to bend. The mansion tested them with every step they took, but it also rewarded them with glimpses of beauty and fragments of memory, like a guardian deciding whether its new caretakers were worthy of its trust. They had already uncovered small details, a hidden cupboard with old keys, a shimmer of stained glass that burst into color at sunset. And, though fatigue sometimes threatened to dull their determination, the sense that the house itself had begun to open its heart to them was enough to carry them forward. It was on one of those long afternoons while clearing debris from the attic that the mansion revealed its most telling relics yet. The attic was a vast space beneath the steeply pitched roof, filled with dust so thick that each step stirred up little clouds that glowed in the shafts of light piercing through the broken slats. The air was suffocating, heavy with the smell of old wood and long-forgotten fabric. They climbed the narrow stairs carefully, brushing cobwebs aside, their lantern throwing trembling shadows across the beams. At first, they found little more than piles of broken wood, the skeletons of chairs and trunks gnawed by time. But against the far wall, half buried beneath the rubble of fallen plaster and decayed rafters, stood a large wooden chest, its iron bands rusted, its lid bowed with age. The young man knelt, brushing away the debris that clung to it. The lock was still intact, though so corroded that it yielded easily to the strike of a hammer. The chest groaned open with a sound like a sigh, as though exhaling the breath of a century, and the dust rose in a plume around them. Inside lay relics of another age, preserved in their silence as if waiting for the day they would once again see the light. The first thing they noticed was a stack of brittle newspapers, their pages yellowed but the print still legible in places. Headlines from a world long gone spoke of wars, economic crises, and social upheavals. Tucked beside them were sepia-toned photographs, stiff and formal, showing men in uniforms and women in long dresses standing proudly before the very mansion where the couple now knelt. The resemblance between the faces in the photographs and the carved moldings of the house was uncanny, as though the house had been shaped in their image. Beneath the papers lay medals and ribbons, dulled with time, but still carrying the weight of honor. They bore insignia of battles fought during the Civil War, their tarnished surfaces whispering of courage and sacrifice. The young woman traced the edge of one medal with her finger, feeling the grooves that had been pressed into it by hands that once trembled with pride or grief. She wondered what those hands had held afterward, what dreams had been carried into these very rooms and left behind when the owners were gone. And then there were the letters. Bound with ribbon frayed almost to threads, they filled the chest with the voice of a woman long dead. Written in careful script, each page carried the intimacy of a heart laid bare. She wrote to her husband, who was away at war, pouring her fears and hopes onto the paper. Some letters were filled with tenderness, words of longing and promises of reunion. Others were heavy with dread, speaking of the loneliness of the house, the fear of illness, and the uncertainty of survival. The young couple read them by the weak light of the lantern, their hearts tightening with each line. They could hear the voice of the woman in the flow of the ink, her love strong but shadowed by sorrow. It was in those letters that the house began to come alive for them in a new way. Until now, they had felt the weight of its silence, the strangeness of its shadows. But now, they felt the pulse of lives once lived, the beating of hearts that had walked those halls, loved in those rooms, grieved at those windows. The mansion was no longer just wood and stone. It was memory itself, carrying within its walls the echoes of those who had once filled it with laughter and tears. As they sat surrounded by the relics, they spoke softly about the family who had left these treasures behind. Perhaps the man had never returned from the war. Perhaps the woman, left alone, had placed the letters carefully into the chest, unable to burn them, but unwilling to leave them scattered. Perhaps she had hoped that someone one day would read them and understand. The thought humbled the couple. They felt like intruders at first, but gradually that feeling shifted to one of guardianship. They had stumbled upon something fragile, and they now carried a responsibility to honor it. The chest held more than objects. It held a story. Each photograph, each medal, each line of ink was a piece of a narrative woven into the very fabric of the house. It revealed a time when the mansion had been more than a ruin. It had been a stage for lives as vivid and complex as their own. The young man closed his eyes and tried to imagine the sound of boots on the staircases, the rustle of dresses in the parlor, the cries of children echoing down the halls. He could almost hear it, faint and distant, as if the house itself remembered. In the evenings that followed, they often returned to the letters, reading them slowly, piecing together the life of the woman who had written them. Her words spoke not only of personal grief but of the struggles of a nation torn apart, of food shortages, of neighbors lost to sickness, of fear that the future would vanish before it began. Yet, amidst all of it, there were passages of hope, where she wrote of planting flowers in the garden, of repairing broken furniture, of keeping the house alive until her husband returned. That hope, fragile though it was, resonated deeply with the couple who now carried the same burden, to keep the house alive, to nurture it back to life through their own love and labor. But along with the sense of intimacy came a strange heaviness. There were moments when the young woman, folding the letters carefully after reading, felt as though the eyes of the writer lingered in the room, watching. At times, when they set the photographs on the mantel, the faces seemed to gaze back with solemn intensity. It was not frightening, not exactly, but it was sobering. They began to understand that they were not merely owners, they were inheritors. They had stepped into a legacy not of their making, one that demanded reverence. The discovery of the chest altered the way they approached the work of restoration. No longer was it just about replacing beams or scrubbing walls. Each stroke of paint, each nail driven into the wood, now felt like an act of preservation, a continuation of lives that had come before. They worked not only for themselves, but for the voices whose echoes they had uncovered. The past was no longer buried. It had risen to meet them, urging them onward. And yet, beneath their awe, questions stirred. Why had the chest been hidden beneath rubble in the attic, rather than kept in the light of day? Why had the letters, so personal and tender, been left behind instead of carried away by descendants? There was an air of secrecy about it, as though the woman who placed them there wanted them to be found, but not too soon. The couple felt the stirrings of mystery, a sense that the house was far from finished with its revelations. As summer deepened, they placed the relics carefully in a safer part of the mansion, promising themselves they would never discard them. They became part of the daily rhythm of the house, reminders that every corner might conceal another secret. And though exhaustion often dragged at their bodies, curiosity burned in their hearts. What else had the house hidden, waiting for the right hands to uncover it? The answer lay not only in the attic, but deeper still, in places where the light had not reached for generations. And soon, as their work carried them toward the basement, they would discover that the mansion had far darker secrets to share, secrets that would bind them even tighter to its story, for better or worse. The discovery of the chest in the attic and the fragile relics it guarded had changed the rhythm of their days. Work still demanded their energy, but each nail they hammered and each plank they pried loose now carried the weight of history. It was no longer only a task of rebuilding, it was a task of listening. The mansion had begun to speak to them, revealing its secrets little by little, and the couple approached it with reverence. Yet, as they worked, they could not escape the feeling that the house had more to tell, and that its deepest secrets lay not in the attic, bathed in slanted sunlight, but in the darkness below. The cellar had long been avoided. Its narrow door at the back of the kitchen was warped and swollen, resisting every attempt to open it. On their first days in the mansion, they had tried to push it, but the hinges were rusted solid, and the stale odor that seeped through the cracks had been enough to send them back to lighter tasks. Now, with the letters and photographs of the attic fresh in their minds, they felt ready to confront what lay beneath. Armed with crowbars and determination, they forced the door open. It groaned like a living thing, shedding flakes of rust and dust, and released a breath of air so damp and musty that it made them cough. Lantern light revealed stone steps that descended into shadow, slick with moisture and lined with cobwebs thick as curtains. Together they went down, the wooden beams creaking overhead as though warning them back. The cellar was larger than they expected, stretching beneath much of the house. Its walls were made of rough-hewn stone, darkened by years of seepage. In some places, earth had pressed through cracks, forming small mounds of soil on the floor. Shelves leaned drunkenly against the walls, their wood rotten. Glass jars collapsed into fragments at their feet. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and their breath puffed visibly in the glow of the lantern. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a forgotten storehouse, a place where time had done its worst. But as they explored further, they noticed something odd about the far wall. Where the stonework elsewhere was rough and irregular, here it was smooth and precise, as though built more recently. The mortar lines were neat, the stones fitted tightly together. It did not match the rest of the foundation. The young woman brushed her hand across it, feeling the difference. There was a hollowness, a resonance that did not belong to solid stone. She glanced at her husband, and in his eyes she saw the same thought. The discovery unsettled them, yet curiosity pulled them closer. They moved aside one of the leaning shelves, revealing iron bolts driven deep into the wall, fastening a sheet of corroded metal against the stone. With effort, they loosened the bolts, the screech of rusted iron echoing through the cellar like a cry. Behind it lay a section of stonework that seemed even more suspicious, the mortar rougher, cruder, as though it had been placed in haste. They struck it with the butt of the crowbar and heard the unmistakable thud of emptiness behind. Something had been sealed away. The work of breaking through was slow and exhausting. Chunks of stone and mortar fell in heavy clatters. Dust filled the air and sweat dripped from their brows despite the cellar's chill. At last, an opening yawned before them, jagged and dark, revealing a narrow passage beyond. It smelled of earth and secrecy, a suffocating mix of damp soil and the metallic tang of rust. They hesitated, hearts pounding, but then crawled through, their lantern casting trembling circles of light ahead. What they entered was not a natural extension of the cellar, but a chamber deliberately carved and then buried. Its ceiling was low, forcing them to stoop, and its walls were lined with bricks unevenly laid, as though built in haste or desperation. The floor was not stone, but packed earth, and much of it had been filled again with soil, heaped into piles that seemed deliberately placed. It felt less like a room and more like a tomb. They searched carefully, moving earth aside with their hands, uncovering fragments of broken wood, shards of glass, and rusted metal. The chamber was nearly empty, as if whatever it had once held had been removed or hidden deeper still. Yet there was no mistaking the intention. This place had been sealed deliberately, hidden from view, its existence scrubbed from the memory of the house. At the center of the chamber, half buried beneath the soil, they found a metal box, its sides dented and its surface caked with rust. With effort, they pulled it free, their hands trembling as they set it upon the uneven floor. The lock was long since useless, and it opened with a snap of brittle hinges. Inside were coins, old and tarnished but still gleaming faintly in the lantern light. Silver dollars, half-dollars, quarters, dated from a century ago. Alongside them lay a handful of jewelry, simple rings and brooches, their stones dulled but intact, and beneath it all, wrapped in rotted fabric, was a book, a diary, its cover of leather cracked, its pages warped by damp. They opened it with care, the ink smudged in places but legible still. The handwriting was hurried, uneven, filled with the desperation of a woman who had once called the mansion her home. Her words spoke of fear, of debts mounting against the family, of whispers among neighbors about misfortune and betrayal. She wrote of illness sweeping through the household, of children coughing in the night, of servants abandoning them. She wrote of the shame of losing their fortune, of the terror that creditors would strip them not only of their wealth, but of their very dignity. And in her later entries, her tone shifted from despair to a strange determination, a resolve to hide what little they had left, to bury it where no one would find it, to seal away a part of their life so that it would not be taken. The couple read in silence, their faces pale in the lantern's glow. They felt as though the walls pressed closer, as though the house itself was listening. The words of the woman were heavy with tragedy, but also with strength. She had fought to protect her family, to preserve what she could in the face of ruin. The chamber they now stood in was the result of her struggle, her desperate act of concealment. When they finally left the chamber, crawling back into the cellar and sealing the opening as best they could, their hearts were full of conflicting emotions. They carried the box with them, unable to leave it behind, but they also carried the weight of the story it told. The mansion was no longer merely a place of beauty waiting to be restored. It was a place of secrets, of lives torn apart and buried beneath the floor. They felt both privileged and burdened to have uncovered it. As they sat later that night, in the dim light of their lantern, the diary between them, they could not shake the feeling that the house was guiding them deliberately, revealing its history piece by piece. The attic had shown them love and longing. The cellar had shown them fear and desperation. What lay ahead they could only imagine. The house had many more shadows, and they were only beginning to walk through them. The discovery of the sealed chamber in the cellar lingered in their minds long after they had left its suffocating darkness. The coins and jewels they had unearthed, the battered diary that trembled with the voice of a woman long gone, these things haunted them far more deeply than the dust or the dampness of the earth. They had gone into the cellar expecting decay and emptiness, perhaps rats or broken jars, but instead they had found a hidden narrative, a testament to fear and survival. That night, when they lay beneath the heavy rafters of the house, they could hardly sleep. The lantern burned low beside them, and the diary lay between their hands like a fragile bridge to another century. By morning, the mansion seemed to wear a new expression. The sun filtered through stained glass and fractured into colors on the walls, but the brightness felt deceptive, as though beneath it lay a weight that could not be shaken. The couple rose and returned to the diary, carefully turning the pages as if they might crumble to dust. The ink was smeared in places where water had warped the paper, but the words were still legible enough to carry the voice of the woman who had written them. Her hand was hurried, uneven, filled with the urgency of desperation. Each line painted a picture of a household collapsing beneath the weight of forces it could not withstand. She wrote of sickness that spread through the house, of children coughing at night and fading before her eyes. She wrote of debts that mounted, creditors who threatened to strip them of everything, and neighbors who whispered about ruin. The grandeur of the mansion had been built on prosperity, but prosperity had turned fickle, and fortune had slipped through their grasp. In her grief and fear, she had hidden what she could: coins, jewelry, the last fragments of her family's wealth. She had buried them beneath the house itself, sealing them away behind stone and soil. The chamber they had uncovered was her desperate fortress, built not of hope but of refusal to surrender. But it was not only fear that filled the pages. There was love, too, fierce and unyielding. She wrote of her husband, a man who struggled against the tide of loss, who vanished for days in search of solutions and returned empty-handed, worn by failure. She wrote of the children, their laughter once filling the halls, their absence turning the house into a hollow shell. And in the final entries, there was despair. Words scratched hurriedly across the pages spoke of a missing child, a daughter who had vanished without explanation. The writer spoke of searching every room, every corner of the grounds, pleading for answers that never came. She wrote of neighbors who avoided her eyes, of servants who fled in fear, of the growing sense that the house itself had turned against her. The couple sat in silence as they read these passages. The air in the room seemed to thicken, as though the sorrow written there had seeped into the very walls. The young woman closed the diary and pressed it against her chest, her eyes wet. She felt the anguish of the mother who had written those words, and in that moment the mansion became more than stone and wood. It became a vessel of grief. The young man reached out and took her hand, his own expression grim. They both understood that in uncovering these words they had accepted a responsibility. They were now keepers of a story that had nearly been lost. Days passed, and they found themselves returning to the diary again and again, as though drawn to it by a force they could not resist. They traced the words until they knew them by heart, reciting passages aloud to one another in the quiet evenings. The more they read, the more they felt the presence of the woman who had written them. It was as though her spirit lingered in the house, not as a ghost, but as an echo that demanded to be heard. They spoke of her often, imagining her pacing the halls, clutching her pen, pouring her fears and her love onto the fragile pages. The house itself seemed to listen when they spoke her name, its walls sighing in the night as though stirred by memory. But along with sympathy came unease. There were questions that gnawed at them, questions the diary did not answer. What had become of the missing child? What had happened to the family after the final entries were written? Why had the diary been hidden rather than preserved openly? The secrecy of the chamber, the deliberate concealment, suggested that the story had not ended cleanly. There was something unresolved, something that had been buried along with the coins and jewels, and though they told themselves it was only history, only the past, they could not shake the feeling that the house itself carried the weight of those unanswered questions. Their work on the mansion continued, but now every task felt different. When they hammered nails into beams, they thought of the man who had once struggled to keep the house standing. When they polished the stained glass, they imagined the children who had once laughed in its light. When they swept dust from the floors, they felt the absence of footsteps that had vanished too soon. The diary had changed their perception. They were not simply restoring a structure. They were tending to a memory, nursing it back to life with each act of care. Yet the burden was heavy. At night, the young woman sometimes dreamed of the missing child, hearing faint cries echoing through the halls. She would wake with her heart pounding, convinced that the sound had been real. The young man, too, felt the strain, his mind haunted by the desperation in the woman's words. He found himself pausing during the day, staring at the walls as though expecting them to speak. They had begun to live not only in their own time, but in another's, caught between the present and the past. Still, they refused to turn away. If anything, the weight of the family's story deepened their resolve. They believed that by restoring the house, by filling it once more with life, they could honor those who had suffered within it. They could give meaning to the woman's desperate act of preservation. The diary became their guide, a reminder that love and grief were bound together, that survival was forged through struggle. As the weeks wore on, they began to sense that the mansion had accepted them. The groans of the beams seemed less menacing, the shadows less hostile. Yet, beneath this fragile peace, the secrets of the house still stirred. The sealed chamber had revealed one truth, but it had not been the last. The mansion had more to tell, and it would demand more of them before its story was finished. They had uncovered love in the attic and despair in the cellar. What remained was to face the mansion's true test, not hidden relics, but the strain it would place upon their own lives. And as the summer waned and money grew thin, as exhaustion gnawed at their strength and doubts crept into their hearts, they would learn that the past was not the only challenge they had to endure. The house had bound itself to them, and its trials would become their own. The diary remained on their table like a silent witness, its pages turned and read until the ink seemed to live in their very veins. They knew the words by heart, knew the fears and hopes of the woman who had written them, and yet each time they opened it, the grief pressed down on them anew. Her tragedies had become part of their household, woven into the fabric of their thoughts, and the mansion itself seemed to breathe her sorrow. But as they worked, it was not only the voices of the past that challenged them. The present began to bear its own weight, and the trials they faced in their marriage and their lives grew heavier with each passing week. At first, the difficulties came as small interruptions. The budget that had once seemed carefully planned now slipped like sand between their fingers. Each time they repaired one part of the house, another revealed itself broken beyond expectation. Pipes burst and demanded replacement. The roof leaked worse than they had feared, and a colony of termites discovered in a beam meant tearing out and rebuilding what they had thought was secure. Bills arrived with grim regularity, and they found themselves calculating, worrying, and sacrificing. The young man worked extra hours when he could, but it was never enough to match the expenses that poured from the old house like water from a sieve. The weight of money pressed against their love. They quarreled over purchases, over what could wait and what could not. The young woman longed to replace the rotting floors in the parlor, while the young man insisted the roof must come first. Voices rose, eyes grew weary, and sometimes they sat in silence, too tired to speak. Yet always, after the storm passed, they found one another again. They remembered the vows they had spoken and the dream that had led them to this place, and they clung to that dream as though it were a lifeline. Exhaustion became their constant companion. Days were filled with the ceaseless rhythm of hammer and saw, of scrubbing mold and hauling debris. Their muscles ached until sleep came not as rest but as collapse. They woke with dust in their lungs and dirt in their hair, and still the work waited. At times, the young woman would look around and feel despair, as though they were digging a hole deeper rather than building upward. The young man, too, would sometimes pause with tools in his hands, staring at the crumbling walls, wondering if they had been foolish to believe they could tame this beast of a house. Yet always, when doubt threatened to overcome them, something would remind them why they stayed. A shaft of sunlight spilling through the stained glass would scatter across the room in colors so vibrant it seemed the house was alive again. The discovery of a carving in the wood, a pattern of leaves and vines hidden beneath layers of paint, would bring a rush of wonder. Even the echoes of footsteps in the halls, imagined or real, carried with them a sense of history that whispered, "Do not give up." The house tested them, yes, but it also rewarded them with moments of beauty and mystery, gifts that seemed to arrive just as their strength faltered. The strain of the work did not fall only on their bodies. It pressed upon their marriage in ways neither had expected. They had entered the house with hearts full of love, confident that together they could overcome anything. But love, like wood, must be tested to prove its strength. There were nights when anger lingered, when exhaustion turned words sharp and unkind. There were mornings when silence hung between them heavier than any beam. Yet always they returned to one another, humbled by the realization that without their bond, the house would devour them. They learned to apologize quickly, to forgive fully, to remind one another that their fight was not against each other, but against time and neglect. The diary became a mirror of their own struggles. The woman's words spoke of hardship, of debts, of sickness, of loss, and in them they saw reflections of their own fears. But they also saw resilience. Despite everything, she had fought to preserve what she could, to protect her family, to hide away some fragment of hope. Her strength became their guide. They read her words aloud in the evenings, not as history, but as counsel, as though she were speaking directly to them. Her trials had been greater than theirs, yet she had endured. So too, they told themselves, would they. Slowly, the fruits of their labor began to show. The parlor, once filled with dust and decay, now gleamed with new polish. The garden, where weeds had once reigned, began to show shoots of green, where flowers pushed through the soil again. A section of the roof, rebuilt and sealed, no longer leaked in the rain. These victories were small compared to the vastness of the work still ahead, but they were victories nonetheless. Each one was a reminder that progress, though slow, was possible. There were moments of joy amid the struggle. One evening, after days of endless toil, the young man lit a fire in the grand old fireplace, its flames leaping against the brick that had not felt warmth in decades. They sat together before it, the crackle of wood filling the silence, and for a brief moment it was as though the house remembered what it meant to be alive. The young woman leaned against her husband, and he wrapped his arm around her, and together they felt that the house was no longer only theirs to restore, it was theirs to live in, to fill with love, to claim as their home. But even in these moments, the mansion remained a reminder of the thin line between triumph and defeat. It was both a sanctuary and a burden, both a promise and a threat. The house had seen families rise and fall, had witnessed love and grief, and now it had bound itself to them. It tested them as it had tested those before, demanding patience, sacrifice, and faith. And though they sometimes faltered, they did not yield. By the time summer waned into autumn, their bodies bore the marks of their labor. Their hands were rough, their backs stooped, their clothes torn and stained. Yet their hearts, though weary, were stronger. They had faced quarrels, doubts, exhaustion, and financial strain, and still they stood together. The mansion had not broken them, it had tempered them. Like iron and fire, their love had been forged anew, proven not by ease but by struggle. And as they looked upon the house, its walls patched, its windows mended, its rooms echoing less with emptiness and more with the sounds of their presence, they felt a cautious pride. The trials had not ended, indeed, more surely awaited, but they had survived enough to believe they could endure the rest. The mansion had given them its challenges, and they had answered. Now, as the wind grew colder and the leaves fell around the garden, they prepared for the next chapter of their journey, where restoration would meet renewal, and where the house would not only hold the past but carry the future as well. The months of strain, of long nights and harder days, had left their mark on both the house and the couple who had dared to claim it. Where once the mansion had groaned with neglect and sighed with the loneliness of decay, now it breathed again. Its timbers still creaked in the night, but the sound was less ominous, more like the stretching of old bones long unused. Its walls, once cloaked in peeling paper and mildew, now glowed with fresh paint that honored the lines of its original craftsmanship. And through its halls no longer wandered only echoes of sorrow, but the living voices of those who had taken upon themselves the duty to restore it. The trials had been fierce, and there were moments when they had nearly been broken, but they had endured, and in enduring, they had claimed the right not only to live within the mansion, but to write themselves into its story. The young woman often stood in the parlor, gazing at the stained glass whose fractured colors fell across the floor. She remembered the first time she had uncovered its beauty, the dust and dirt that had concealed it, the way the colors had burst into flame when the sun set behind it. Now, with the floor beneath restored and the walls gleaming, the light seemed even richer, filling the room with warmth. It was as though the house itself approved, as though it too had waited for the moment when it would shine once more. The young man, meanwhile, often paused at the fireplace where they had first lit a flame after decades of silence. Each time he placed a log upon it and watched the sparks leap upward, he felt as though he was kindling not only warmth but memory, restoring to the house the sense of being alive. They had not forgotten the secrets that had brought them this far. The attic, with its chest of photographs and medals, the cellar with its sealed chamber, the diary whose words still lay heavy upon their hearts, these were no longer curiosities. They had become part of the fabric of the house, part of the bond the couple felt with it. And so, instead of locking them away or selling them, they chose to preserve them. They set aside a room where these relics could remain, not as museum pieces to be stared at from afar, but as silent companions, reminders of the lives that had come before. To walk into that room was to walk into a conversation across centuries, to feel the presence of those whose joys and sorrows had once filled the mansion. Yet the couple did not live only in the shadow of the past. They had endured too much, struggled too hard not to imagine the future. And so, as their restoration neared its completion, they began to leave traces of their own. Behind the walls they had rebuilt, beneath the floors they had laid with such care, they slipped envelopes containing letters to those who might one day find them. They wrote of who they were, of what they had endured to bring the house back to life, of the hopes they carried for the years ahead. They placed photographs of their wedding day, newspaper clippings that told of the world they lived in now, and coins from their time, small tokens of a life that to them was ordinary but to others, years from now, might be treasure. They smiled at the thought of someone, decades or even centuries away, discovering these fragments just as they had discovered those left behind. The circle of memory would continue, unbroken. As winter drew near, they walked often through the garden, now cleared of its wild overgrowth. New shoots had begun to sprout where once only weeds had ruled. The young woman bent often to tend them, her hands in the soil, and felt that in caring for the garden she was caring for the house itself. The young man repaired the iron fence they had unearthed, piece by piece, until once again it formed a barrier of spirals and fleur-de-lis, proud though scarred with rust. The mansion, once cut off and abandoned, now stood once again as a part of the land, embraced by life rather than choked by it. Neighbors who had once watched their efforts with skepticism began to stop by more often. They marveled at the transformation, at the beauty that had been restored. Some brought stories of the families who had once lived there, fragments of memory passed down from older generations. Others came only to gaze, to shake their heads at what had seemed impossible, now made real. And the couple welcomed them, for they knew that the house was not theirs alone. It belonged in some way to everyone who had ever known it, to everyone who had ever wondered what lay within its walls. By opening it, by sharing it, they made it whole again. But it was in the quiet evenings, when the lanterns were lit and the fire burned low, that they felt most deeply what they had accomplished. They would sit together, weary from the day's labor, and listen to the silence that no longer felt empty but full. The silence carried the weight of history, yes, but also the promise of tomorrow. They spoke of children they hoped to have, of dinners to host, of music to play in the halls. They spoke of laughter and love, of filling the rooms with life so abundant that the shadows of grief would be pushed back forever. And as they spoke, they felt the house listening, not with sorrow this time, but with gratitude. The mansion had been a ruin when they found it. It had been a place of decay, of secrets buried and grief unspoken. Now it was alive again, not because the dust had been swept or the walls repainted, but because it had been filled once more with love. They had taken upon themselves not only the burden of restoration, but the responsibility of remembrance. They had honored the past and prepared the future, and in doing so, they had woven themselves into the story of the house. On the first snow of winter, they stood together at the window, watching the flakes drift silently down. The house was warm around them, the fire crackling, the stained glass glowing even in the pale light. The young man wrapped his arm around his wife, and she leaned against him, her eyes shining with both weariness and joy. They had endured trials that might have broken them, but instead they had grown stronger. The house had tested them, but in the end it had accepted them. They had made it their home, not just in name, but in truth. And so, beneath the falling snow, the mansion stood tall once more, no longer a relic of what had been, but a beacon of what could be. It carried within its walls the echoes of the past, the struggles of the present, and the promises of the future. It was not only a house. It was a story, one that had begun long before them and would continue long after. They had become part of that story, and as they pressed their hands against the cold glass, watching the snow cover the garden they had reclaimed, they knew that the legacy of the mansion was now their own. It would endure as they had endured, and long after their footsteps had faded from its halls, long after their letters and photographs lay hidden for another to find, the house would remember them. For they had given it what it had always needed: life, love, and the promise of tomorrow. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next unbelievable story waiting to be uncovered. Click now to watch the next video. Each one is more shocking than the last. And if this story left you amazed, share it with your friends and family so they can discover the secrets too. The more people who join us, the bigger the mysteries we'll reveal together.